Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Yes, look, I wanted to continue a bit more questioning on the Maribyrnong Defence site. So, and thanks for the information, Mr. How do I say your name? Grzykowiak, for the information so far. So starting with the remediation. So far on the Maribyrnong site, we've had 2 areas that have been remediated. The 13 hectare that you did 2 years ago, that was correct?
That's right.
Yes, and at a cost of $4 to $5 million. I think you told us an estimate some time ago.
Around $4 million.
Yes, and then there's the second site, which is 11 hectares. That's right, and that's what's currently underway.
That's correct.
Yes, and what's the estimated cost of that site?
Around $54 million.
Right, and that's going to be completed within.
We estimate around 18 months from February this year, when the remediation and investigation completed.
Right, and so what's the size of the remaining areas of the site that are then yet to be remediated?
The total area of the site is 127 hectares, so of the order of 100 hectares, and the remediation of the bulk of the site is something that will be done by whoever ultimately purchases the site from government.
Yes, I gather that from your previous evidence to estimates. Do you have a current estimate as to what the cost of that remediation will be, whether to be done by whoever?
No, we have done estimates of remediation for the site over time, and the information we've done in terms of analysis and investigation on the site will be made fully available to potential purchasers, and clearly that will be factored into their offers for the site in terms of the development potential of the place.
You advised the Australian National Audit Office, I understand, in November 2015, so a couple of years ago, that the current estimate of further required expenditure was $309 million. So this estimate is dependent upon the final remediation option, but is the expected maximum. Is that the ballpark that you are still expecting?
I'm reluctant to talk about what I think the remediation costs might be at this stage. We know more about the site now than we did in 2016. We've already remediated a relatively small site of relatively straightforward contamination. We're now remediating the site that is the most complex in terms of the contamination, and so I would expect any estimate of the remediation of the remaining roughly 100 acres probably to be lower than the figure you've quoted, but I'd be hesitant to quote the figure because I don't have a detailed analysis. So as we go to industry, this is one of the issues that is why we've been to market already. It's why we're going to do expressions of interest through this 3-phase process, so we can make sure that those organisations that might bid for the site ultimately are fully informed to the best that we can inform them of the nature of the contamination on the bulk of the site, and therefore they can factor that in to their estimates for what they might choose to offer for the site.
So that $309 million estimate, did that include the cost of the site that's currently being remediated?
At the time when that estimate was made, that included the whole property. Obviously now, Defence is now funding the most complex part of the remediation.
Right. And so that complex part, which so that's at 55 million is the estimate?
Around 54 million.
Okay, so, and then you've spent 4 million on the less 4 to 5 on the less complex.
Yeah.
So on that estimate of 309, that would have then mean that for the remaining portions of the site, you're looking at around the $250 million, but as you say, still subject to change depending upon the further information as it comes to hand.
Yeah, I'm not in a position to give an estimated figure. Things have moved on considerably since that figure was presented to the ANAO in 2016.
But
I actually think the figure will be significantly lower than
Right.
the number you've just quoted.
Okay. And when do you think you will have an estimate of what the full extent of the contamination and what the likely costs would be to give to potential purchasers of the site?
I won't have one. I'll provide all of the information that we know about the site, details of the remediations that we have done, all of the reports that we've had done by specialists on the remaining contamination, and industry will form its view and factor that into the price that it might offer to purchase the site.
And will all of that information be available to the public as well?
Certainly available to those companies that might bid for the site. I'm not sure we'd necessarily make it available to the public, but certainly available to all of those companies that are involved in the tendering process.
Why wouldn't you make the information available to the public?
I'm not sure what the value would be. I can take it on notice to ask whether we would do that. We wouldn't normally do that. We'd normally make it fully available to companies that might be seeking to acquire the site. The important point here is that when remediation is undertaken at a place like Maribyrnong, in this case, the Victorian Government's Environmental Protection Agency are fully involved in that process in terms of oversight. And so at the conclusion of remediation, we will get a certificate from the Victorian EPA that acknowledges that the remediation has been done to their required standards. So I'm talking now about the remediation Defence is doing. As and when a private entity acquires that site for redevelopment, they will have to go through a similar process. The remediation that they do will have to meet Victorian EPA standards, will be oversighted by the Victorian EPA, who will issue a certificate that the remediation has been done correctly, if that is the view of the Victorian EPA. So if your concern is that the remediation might not be effectively conducted, then I can assure you that the relevant Victorian state government agencies are well connected into what we're doing. They will be well connected into what a private developer would do, and they will insist on appropriate standards being reached.
People are very concerned about the potential about the contamination of the site, and particularly given it's going to be used for housing development. So would you have any reason as to why that information, given it's going to be made available, obviously to the EPA, to all potential purposes, why it should not be made available to the public?
Yeah, I'll take that on notice. Yeah.
Thank you. And so once you sell the site with all that information about remediation, so then the final responsibility for remediation will rest with the purchaser of the site. So Defence is able to then wash its hands of the site, so to speak?
So we will have remediated the area of the site with contaminants unique to Defence. The broader site, the contaminants on the broader site are the sorts of contaminants that industry is well able to deal with. It'll be the responsibility of the purchaser to undertake that remediation. So
that as part of the sale process, you will be handing over that responsibility. And so any risk that there is unknown contamination, that things aren't, as you understand them to be, that risk will be borne by the purchaser.
That's right, but we will be providing extensive information on the research that has already been done over a period of some years about the contaminants on that site, and we think we have a pretty good understanding of the broad area of the site, of the level of contamination.
So then, as you've indicated, the cost of the decontamination will be borne by the purchaser. Have you aware of any suggestions that, in terms of the purchase of that land, and potential interest in having housing developed there, and it was spruiked by the government as being a significant housing development, that the cost could be borne by the government's proposed National Housing Finance Investment Corporation or the National Housing Infrastructure Facility?
I'm certainly aware of that, and I imagine that is a facility that could be accessed by whoever it is who eventually takes control of the site through the process that exists.
So how would that process work then?
I'm not across the detail of the process, but as I understand it, a developer or a local authority has the opportunity to apply for money through that process to help build infrastructure around housing developments.
So at the end of the day, it could be the government that ends up paying for that decontamination then?
I very much doubt if that fund would be accessible for decontamination. It's about infrastructure and investment in, so it'd be things like roads and transport links would be the sort of thing that fund would potentially pay for.
But if decontamination is an essential part of bringing that land to market, you don't think that there would be a possibility of those funds paying for that as, you know, what's required?
That's not the intention, Senator, as was indicated at the time of the announcement last year.
Okay, not the intention, Minister, but is it ruled out that those funds would not be able to pay for decontamination?
Oh, well, that's not the purpose for which the funds are
But
intended,
is it ruled
Senator.
out, Minister?
Well, Senator, the funds are specifically directed to a particular set of tasks, as Mr Kreshkowiak has outlined. It's not the intention that they're used for the purpose that you're canvassing.
But would it be ruled out that they cannot be used for that purpose?
Well, Senator, I think it's a matter for the Department of Treasury, obviously, but the clear purpose of those funds is set out in the material relating to housing support.
So, but you're not ruling it out, Minister?
Senator, I'm not the Treasurer.
Okay.
I'm the Minister for Defence.
So it's still a possibility, is what I gather from your answer.
No, you should not assume that at all, Senator. In fact, you would be wilfully misrepresenting what I said, which is not entirely surprising, I suppose. But the point that I make is that these are funds which are managed through the Treasury process in relation to housing. Mr Kreshkowiak has very helpfully outlined the purpose for which they are intended, and I am not playing a game with you over ruling things in or out. I'm saying that I am not the Treasurer and they're not my funds to manage.
Thank you, Minister. I'll take it up with the Treasurer then. So then moving on to the sale of the site. So you said in answer to Senator Gallagher that you're looking at going out to market in August for expressions of interest, then a formal request for tender next year. So at this stage, have you had, prior to that August expressions of interest, has there been any other sort of informal discussions with potential purchasers?
So I said earlier, we conducted a market sounding process in the first quarter of this year. That process concluded in April of this year. We had 23 different companies that come and talk to us about that, and it was very useful exchange of information in terms of possible developments, the issues around remediation and the like. So that process has concluded. We'll be going to market for expressions of interest later in the year. I've suggested that might be August, but it could be July or it could be September. And then following that process next year, we'll be in a position to formally seek requests for proposal for purchase of the site.
And of those 23 companies that responded to your market sounding, they were all accepting of the risk that they were taking on with decontamination?
I wasn't involved in the conversations in detail, but my understanding is that the suggestion that industry should manage the decontamination of the site is not seen as a showstopper in this case.
Okay. Was there an expression of interest through that process from the Enrichment Holdings Group that had made a sort of unsolicited expression of interest in 2017?
I don't know if they were at those meetings. I'd have to take that on notice. We did have an unsolicited proposal around a year ago. I can't recall the name of the consortium.
I think that was the Enrichment Holdings Group.
But we advised that consortium that we were following a process. They were more than welcome to engage in the process.
So you can't tell me whether they indeed did engage with the process?
No, well, I'd have to take that on notice.
Okay.
I don't have the list of the companies that were there.
And so were there any other unsolicited approaches, or have all of the other approaches been through your market sounding process?
I'm only aware of one unsolicited bid that was received by the department.
And in terms of those 23 companies that put in bids, what countries were those potential buyers from?
Just to clarify, the 23 companies have not put in bids.
No,
They
sorry,
attended
that was-
an information session
Yes.
with the Department of Defence. I don't have the list of which companies they were, so I'd need to take that on notice.
Okay. Thank you. And can you give me then an update as part of this process as to whether any discussions regarding the planning of the site and potential zoning of the site, and so the intensity of development which will be permitted on the site?
So the planning schema for the site ultimately is the responsibility of the Victorian Government and the local council. The Victorian Government are taking the lead through their planning authority. Obviously, the council, the government are working closely on that because it helps Defence to have a well-developed and mature planning schema as we go to market to sell the site
Yes.
next year, because that obviously informs industry in terms of how they might value the site in terms of its potential development. So that's the lead for that is the Victorian Government Planning Authority. Defence plays no role in deciding for the future what type of developments can be undertaken.
But you're expecting to have, your desire is to have some fairly clear guidelines in terms of what would be permitted on the site before you go out to market in August.
As would be normal for the disposal of what is a significant, urban infill development site.
So do you expect that, so in terms of the process that the Victorian Government is undertaking then, that's August is not very far away.
In August, we're not going out for bids to buy the site. We're going out for expressions of interest.
But expressions of interest would depend upon what the scale of development that is allowed on that site. So you'd expect to have you would expect to know, for example, what the density of development, which parts of the site would be up for development in order for companies to put in meaningful expressions of interest.
I'd expect to know those details before I go to market looking for formal requests in response to a tender. I don't need to know the final development schema rules for the expressions of interest process. Obviously, the more developed it is, the better that is for us. But the real, I really need that in 2019 when we go to market finally saying who'd like to buy the site and what are you going to offer.
And to reiterate, Senator, that is a matter for the Victorian Government, as Mr Breshkoviak has said, and of course the local council, I'm sorry.
Would you, the issue of the value of this land, would you agree that there would be a significant increase in the value of this land if it was serviced by a train line, such as the Melbourne Airport rail line?
They're not matters on which Mr Greshkoviak should be expected to express an opinion, Senator. Quite clearly, members...
Well, what would be the impact on the
officials are
sale
not
price of
expected
the
to express
defence
an
land,
opinion.
of this defence land, if it was serviced by
Again, we
a train
don't
line?
we don't speculate on matters like that, Senator. Your questions really are not appropriately directed to this department.
Have there been discussions with the Victorian Government or with the Department of Infrastructure about the potential of a train line servicing this defence site?
Yes, there are ongoing discussions. My understanding is there are at least 3 possible routes for that train line. One of them brings it certainly close to or into the Maribyrnong site. So we're engaged in those discussions. They are ongoing discussions.
And in your discussions, would you agree that that if there was a train line service in this site, this would substantially increase the value of the land?
Senator, we're not going to speculate on those sorts of matters. I thought I'd made that quite clear.
Do you expect to have a decision made on whether the train line will service the site before you go out with your market sounding?
It's not a matter for this department, Senator.
Later in August.
It's not a matter for this department, Senator.
Will the results of your discussions about the train line be fed into your analysis about the value of the site?
That would depend on if a decision has been made about that rail line. It's not a decision for Defence. It's a decision for the Department of Infrastructure and the Victorian Government.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Oh, actually, can I actually just, sorry, one
Please.
final, moving away from Maribyrnong, I just wondered whether there was any update on the potential sale of land to, regarding the land acquisition related to the North East Link, so the Watsonia Barracks land.
I'm aware that discussions are ongoing. I don't have an update in terms of finalisation of that discussion at the moment, but Defence seeks to work cooperatively with local governments in terms of enabling the sort of infrastructure that link would provide, but I don't have an update.
You aren't able to tell me on the timing of negotiations or discussions?
No.
Could you take on notice whether there is any further detail that you would be able to share with us about those negotiations, particularly the timing of any potential acquisition of the land?
I'll take that on notice.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Rice.